It was before dawn. He hadn't slept. He knew she would come. She always came. He had made his decision the night before, not because he feared God, not because he cared what anyone thought. He made it because she had ground him down to nothing. The knock came right on time. Before we get there, I need to ask you something. Have you ever stopped praying for something? Not because the answer came, but because it didn't. Because the silence felt final. Because at some point, continuing to ask felt less like faith and more like foolishness. We've all been there. The job you prayed about for 3 years, the relationship you handed over and watched fall apart anyway, the diagnosis that didn't change, and then one day, quietly, without any announcement, you stopped. Not with a dramatic speech, no "I give up" moment. You just didn't bring it up again. This story is about a woman who never did that, and about a judge who was counting on her to. We're going back to that door. But first, what made her keep knocking? First-century Palestine had 2 kinds of courts. The religious courts, the synagogue system, run by elders embedded in community life who had reputations to protect and relationships at stake, and the civil courts, Roman-appointed local magistrates who answered to a different authority entirely. This judge belonged to the second kind. Luke tells us 2 things about him. He did not fear God, and he did not care what people thought. In a culture where both of those things were the bedrock of a man's social identity, that was not a small statement. This man had no shame. He operated outside the 2 systems that normally kept power in check. He was, in the most practical sense, accountable to no one. Now understand what that meant for a widow in that world. A widow in first-century Jewish society had no legal standing without a male advocate, a husband, a son, a brother, someone who could appear in court, argue her case, put social weight behind her claim. Without one, she had almost nothing. No property rights, no way to enforce a contract, no one to back her up. This particular widow had a grievance. Someone owed her something, an inheritance perhaps, money taken, a debt unpaid. The text doesn't tell us, but what it does tell us is that she had nowhere to go except to this judge who feared nothing and cared for no one. The court was not a permanent building in most small towns. It was a place and a time, a public square, a predictable hour when the magistrate made himself available for petitions. Dust in the air, the smell of the market nearby, men with cases lined up, and somewhere in that line, her. She came. The first time he ignored her or turned her away. She came back. He turned her away again. She came back again. This wasn't stubbornness without strategy. In a system without legal aid, without advocates for the poor, without appeals, the only recourse a powerless person had was presence. You showed up. You kept showing up. You made yourself impossible to dismiss. There is a Greek word that first-century listeners would have recognized, hypopiazo. It means to strike under the eye, to blacken someone's eye. Luke uses it here, softened in most translations as wear out or weary me, but the original image is physical. She was not waiting quietly. She was landing blows, not with her hands, with her refusal to disappear. The town would have known. In a small community, everyone watched the courts. Everyone saw her come. Everyone saw her turned away. Everyone watched to see what the judge would do and what she would do next. Her persistence was a public act, and the judge's continued refusal was a public statement too. One of them was going to break. Let's sit with the judge for a moment. He had built a life around not caring. That takes work. It is not a natural state. Somewhere along the way, he had made a series of decisions to stop being moved by the expectations of others. Maybe he had watched corrupt men succeed. Maybe honesty had cost him something once. Whatever it was, he had arrived at a philosophy. Do what benefits you, let nothing else in. He was probably competent in a technical sense. He knew the law, he processed cases, he collected his pay, he went home. He had simplified his life down to a clean transaction, and it had worked until her. He woke one night thinking about her, not because he cared, because she had gotten into his routine. He was a man who ran on predictability. Cases in, cases out, no loose ends. She was a loose end that kept reappearing. A small irritant that had somehow grown into the last thing he thought about before sleep. He hated that. He hated that she had done this to him without even trying. The judge's psychology is worth noting carefully here. He didn't change his mind because he was moved by her suffering. He wasn't suddenly struck by justice. He said it himself, out loud, to no one. Even though I do not fear God or care about people, I will give her justice because she keeps wearing me down. He is not converted. He is exhausted. Now look at the widow. She had every reason to give up. No advocate, no money, no leverage. A judge with the power to simply never call her case, to let it sit in a pile until she stopped coming. In a system designed to forget her, she had one asset. She kept showing up. What goes through someone's mind on the 14th morning, the 22nd? At some point, hope can start to look like delusion. The people watching probably shook their heads. She's still going? Does she really think this will work? She thought it would work, not with fresh certainty every morning, with the same original conviction, worn down to its simplest form. My right is real. The judge exists, and not asking is worse than the silence. There are two characters in this story. One is powerful and unmoved. One is powerless and immovable. Only one of them wins. Jesus told this parable, the text says, to show his disciples that they should always pray and not give up. But There is a hidden tension in that instruction that the words do not fully carry. Because giving up on prayer isn't usually a dramatic event. It doesn't feel like failure at the time. It feels like wisdom, like maturity, like releasing control. We have a whole spiritual vocabulary for giving up that makes it sound like surrender to God, not from Him. I'm letting go. I'm releasing it. I've placed it in His hands. And sometimes those phrases are exactly right. But sometimes they are what we tell ourselves when the silence has become too painful to keep asking into. How do you know the difference? The widow didn't face that question. Her situation was external and concrete. Someone owed her something, and the mechanism for getting it was this judge. There was no ambiguity about whether to keep asking. The only question was whether she had enough in her to keep going. Our asking is usually less clear. We pray about things where the mechanism isn't obvious, where yes and no and wait all look identical from the outside, where years pass without any visible signal that the request has been received. And the judge in us, the internal voice that says this isn't working, a reasonable person would stop. That voice gets louder over time. Notice what Jesus doesn't do in this parable. He doesn't explain the theology of unanswered prayer. He doesn't tell us why God allows delay. He doesn't tell us whether the widow's case was just. We never find out what her grievance was. He doesn't even say the judge was wrong to delay. Obviously he was, but that's not the point. The point is, she didn't stop. But here's what the story hasn't told us yet. And this is the part that changes everything. After the parable ends, Jesus asks a question. Not, will you keep praying? Not, do you trust God? He asks something stranger. When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? That question has been sitting underneath this entire story, underneath the widow's persistence, underneath the judge's grudging justice. Jesus isn't asking about prayer technique. He's asking what we will look like after years of waiting. Back to that morning before dawn. The judge made his decision. He didn't sleep the night before. He lay there, turning the case over. Not the legal case. He had processed that in 20 minutes. But the problem of her, the fact that she existed, the fact that she kept existing in his public space, making him the man who couldn't handle one persistent widow with no power and no advocate. He got up before the usual hour. He called her case. He gave her justice. The text doesn't describe her reaction. No tears recorded, no celebration, no speech of gratitude. She had come for her right, and her right was given. What happened next? We do not know. But Jesus does something remarkable here. He doesn't let the story end with her win. He pivots immediately to God. Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice, and quickly. Here is the argument. If a man with no conscience eventually gave way to persistent asking, how much more will a God who actually loves you respond? This is an argument from the lesser to the greater. If even that, how much more this? But Jesus doesn't let the crowd rest there. He doesn't let the math feel comfortable. He asks, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? That question is the real climax of this story, because Jesus is not asking whether faith will survive in some abstract sense. He is asking something sharper. Will people still be asking? Will they still be at the door? Or will they have decided one quiet morning that the silence meant no, and walked away without telling anyone? The deep problem underneath this story has nothing to do with prayer technique. The deep problem is this: persistent asking requires a specific belief. It requires believing that the God you are asking is both able and willing, not one or the other, both at the same time. People stop praying for two reasons. Some stop because they no longer believe God is able. The universe is mechanical. Their view of things has shifted. They've moved on. But some stop for a stranger reason. They stop because they suspect God is not willing, that the thing they are asking for is not something He has decided to give. And rather than sit with that possibility, rather than face the silence as a real silence, they stop framing it as a request. They call it acceptance. They call it trust. Jesus is asking, is that trust? Or is that the sound of faith quietly leaving the building? The widow didn't face this version of the problem. Her judge was obviously unjust. She knew she was right. She knew the answer should be yes. She just had to outlast his indifference. We are not always so sure. We pray for healing that doesn't come, for relationships that don't repair, for children who don't return, for peace that doesn't arrive. And at some point, the lines blur. Is continuing to ask faith, or is it the inability to accept the answer? There is no algorithm for this. Jesus doesn't give us one, but He tells us a story about a woman who kept knocking. And He tells us that the God on the other side of our door is not an unjust judge. He is not someone who opens because we've worn Him down. He is someone already inclined toward us, already aware of every morning we showed up. There's a reason Jesus ends with that question about the Son of Man. He has been talking with His disciples about long waiting, about a time of difficulty that will test everything. He knows what extended waiting does to people, how a generation that begins with fire can end with exhaustion, how communities that once prayed out loud end up praying in silence, then in whispers, then not at all. He is warning them. The test is not whether you start. The test is whether you're still there. The widow wasn't remembered for the day she first went to court. She is remembered because she went back. 20 times, 100 times. The story doesn't give us the number. She went back until the number stopped mattering, until the outcome took over the counting. What does faith look like after 3 years of unanswered prayer? It doesn't look like certainty. It doesn't look like peace. It often looks like a person who is tired and still going, working with the same original conviction they had on day one, worn down to its simplest form. The door is real. Someone is on the other side, and my knock still counts. The knock in the darkness came right on time that morning. The door opened, not because the judge had changed, because she had refused to accept his silence as her answer. What did she believe on that last morning that she hadn't believed on the first? Nothing new. The same 3 things. Her right was real. The request was legitimate. And the one who could give her justice still existed. She had simply decided those 3 things were still true. That's the whole mechanism. You don't need more faith than she had. You don't need a feeling or a fresh revelation. You just need to believe, this morning again, that the door still exists, that someone is on the other side, and that your knock still counts. In 2008, researchers at the University of Michigan published a study on what they called prayer fatigue, the phenomenon where people who pray intensely over a long period without receiving what they asked for gradually shift their understanding of prayer itself. The study followed 2 groups: those who continued praying for specific outcomes over extended periods, and those who stopped. The ones who stopped didn't typically stop believing in God. They stopped believing that their specific asking made a difference. They reframed prayer as a practice of inner peace, valuable, they said, but disconnected from outcomes. The researchers called it defensive disengagement, a way of protecting yourself from the pain of an unanswered request by changing what you define as an answered one. It looks like maturity. It feels like acceptance. But underneath it, there is often something else. There is a woman from the 14th century named Julian of Norwich. She had been praying intensely for years to understand the meaning of suffering. Not just intellectually, she wanted to feel it, to know it from within. She kept asking. In 1373, she fell gravely ill and experienced a series of visions that she spent the rest of her life unpacking. Her writing, Revelations of Divine Love, became one of the most profound texts of the medieval period. She didn't get what she asked for on her timeline. She kept asking. And eventually, the answer came in a form she hadn't anticipated. "All shall be well," she wrote. Not "all is well now." All shall be well. Future tense, persistent tense, the tense of someone still at the door. Think about the entrepreneur who submitted the same business plan to 47 investors before anyone said yes, not because they were delusional, because they believed the underlying idea was sound. The rejection hadn't changed the reality of what they built. They kept asking. James Dyson made 5,127 prototypes of his vacuum cleaner before the design worked. 5,127. The case didn't change. He kept going back to it. Think about the parent who prayed for their child every morning for 15 years while that child wanted nothing to do with them. Not because the prayer was visibly working, because the love didn't have an off switch, because they couldn't look at the door and stop knocking, even when no one answered. Who is on your road right now? What is the request you've stopped framing as a request and started calling acceptance? What is the name of the thing you handed over and privately concluded God had decided against? The widow teaches us something uncomfortable. Persistence is not passive. It is not waiting quietly in a corner for things to sort themselves out. It is the active daily choice to go back, to knock again, to say, out loud or in silence, the door is still there, and I still believe it can open. The parable also teaches us something about the one on the other side. The judge was indifferent. He opened the door because he had no other option, because she had made the cost of refusing greater than the cost of giving in. He was exhausted into justice. God is not the judge. That is the entire point. If even the indifferent judge can be moved, how much more is God already moved, already leaning toward you, already aware of every single morning you showed up? There is a practical question here. How do you know when persistence becomes unhealthy? When does asking cross into obsession? When does faith start looking like magical thinking? Here is the test the widow gives us. She wasn't asking for something impossible. She was asking for what was legitimately hers. She wasn't demanding that the judge change the laws of the universe. She was asking him to do his job. The difference between persistent prayer and obsessive asking is often this. Persistent prayer holds the outcome loosely while holding the relationship tightly. You keep coming to the door, not because you're certain of exactly what you'll receive, but because you trust the one inside. She trusted the system, even a broken version of it, enough to keep engaging. She didn't stop showing up because the judge hadn't fixed the world. She showed up because he had the specific power to do the specific thing she needed. When you don't know whether to keep asking, ask whether you still trust the one you're asking, not whether you trust the outcome, whether you trust the relationship. That trust is the door. When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? Not perfect faith, not triumphant faith, not faith that never doubted or wavered or almost walked away. Faith that went back, that knocked again on a morning when it had every reason not to, that brought the same request to the same door and refused to let the silence be the final answer. You know what you've been carrying. You know what you quietly stopped asking for. The door is still there. What's it going to cost you to knock again?